Well, good evening and welcome to our Thursday evening online class and to the 9th of our 12 short studies on the book of the Prophet Ezekiel. Following last week's rather mammoth section in which we covered a rather large portion of the book, this week we're going to be focusing on just a couple of chapters and coming to the end of the first major section of the book. So here is our outline, and here in week 9 we'll be looking at the ugly sisters and the bereaved watchman. Quick reminder of our simple 5-point outline that we've committed to our memories, and here we are still in this first major section between chapters 4 and 24, but we're coming to the end of that this evening. This section, which has been looking forward to the destruction of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. But of course, as we've been seeing all along, this is a judgment at the hand of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now, this evening we're going to be looking at what is a particularly shocking section featuring two most shameless sisters before marking a notable date in the life of the nation, followed by an even more notable date in the life of the prophet. Let's take a look at our outline specifically for this evening as we look at the ugly sisters and the bereaved watchman. We're going to be taking a look at chapter 23, first of all, in which we'll be introduced to Oholah and Oholibah. Then we'll focus on the older sister for a short while. That's Oholah. And then our attention will be turned to the younger sister and her downfall. Then we will be looking at the sisters being sentenced there at the end of chapter 23. Then we'll see, as we turn our attention to chapter 24, we'll take note of the beginning of the siege, and then in the final section, we'll see how the prophet is left devastated. Well, let's begin by taking a look at the ugly sisters. This might well arguably be the most shocking or the most obscene chapter in the whole of Scripture, particularly if read in a more modern version. So please do be warned. In some ways, it's an expansion of things that we saw in chapter 16 when we read of the unimaginable unfaithfulness of the bride of God. The language here is intentionally explicit or shocking in order to highlight the disgust and the degree of depravity of Israel's spiritual profanity and rebellion. And we do well to remember that the adultery and prostitution spoken of here is not of a physical nature, though physical terminology is used, but it's speaking of their intrigues and their dealings and schemings with the foreign nations as they commit spiritual adultery with them. So what about these two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah? The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, there were two women, daughters of the same mother. They became prostitutes in Egypt, engaging in prostitution from their youth. In that land their breasts were fondled and their virgin bosoms caressed. The older was named Oholah, and her sister was Oholibah. They were mine, and gave birth to sons and daughters. Oholah is Samaria, and Oholibah is Jerusalem. It might be useful to understand chapter 16 as something of a context where Jerusalem is representing the people of God. If you remember, towards the end of that chapter, we read that you are the daughter of your mother, who loathed her husband and her children. And you are the sister of your sisters, who loathed their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father an Amorite. And your elder sister is Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north of you, and your younger sister, who lived to the south of you, is Sodom with her daughters. Well, here in chapter 23, there is no mention of Sodom, nor of Hittite or Amorite descent. This is simply to be a story of two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, representing the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel, respectively. Well, as for their names, Oholah is Samaria and Oholibah is Jerusalem. As for the meanings of their names, Oholah seems to mean her tent, and Oholibah, my tent is in her. There's a little bit of discrepancy as to the exact meanings. Some debate this, but it would be difficult to hear those names and not think of the tabernacle in which God dwelt among his people. The meaning, her tent, could perhaps suggest that the worship of Samaria was not centered on Yahweh. The meaning, my tent is in her, could perhaps suggest that Jerusalem was the place to worship. We might remember the conversation that Jesus has with a certain woman from Samaria, recorded in John chapter 4. So if that's the idea, that Jerusalem is the place to worship inasmuch as Yahweh's tent is in her, well, they really should have known better. Perhaps that's the idea here. And these identifications are not completely clear, but there certainly seems to be some sort of occultic association, although not are in agreement with that. Well, as for their conduct, they became prostitutes in Egypt, engaging in prostitution from their youth. Of course, technically, in Egypt, they were one people. They were not yet divided into north and south, as they were following the division of the kingdom, following the reign of Solomon. But this is just a story, and it's serving to highlight perhaps the inherent depths of her depravity. And their prostitution in Egypt was evident in two ways. Firstly, there was their adoration or infatuation with the gods of Egypt. You might remember what Ezekiel had said back in chapter 20, on the day when I chose Israel, I swore to the offspring of the house of Jacob, making myself known to them in the land of Egypt. I swore to them, saying, I am Yahweh your God. On that day I swore to them that I would bring them out of the land of Egypt into a land that I had searched out for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most glorious of all lands. And I said to them, cast away the detestable things your eyes feast on, every one of you. Do not defile yourself with the idols of Egypt, for I am Yahweh your God. But they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. None of them cast away the detestable things their eyes feasted on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. As an illustration of that, perhaps, I want to show you a 19th century scarab seal that was discovered on the morning of the 2nd of July in the year 2014. I know that because I was there and I discovered it. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. It's a scarab seal. Don't know if you can see it there in the picture. If you look very closely, you might just spot it. There we go. There's a little hint for you. And let's get a little closer and see it in situ. There it is, a scarab seal discovered here at Tel Beth Shemesh, which was a Levitical city. And the name of the city was the House of the Sun. And it might be significant to note that this 19th dynasty scarab seal was a seal of Amun-Ra, the chief deity of the Egyptians, as a fusion of the god Amun, who had been the principal deity of the Egyptians, along with Ra, who had been also the god of the sun. Well, there's maybe some significance that it was discovered in the Levitical city of Beth Shemesh, the name of which was the House of the Sun. And here are the official photographs of that seal once it had been cleaned up and made all official, as it were. So there is evidence there. And there was much more evidence, of course, throughout the land of the adoration or the infatuation that the Israelites continued to have with the gods of Egypt. And then there was also their inexplicable reliance upon Egypt in times of trouble, seen frequently throughout their turbulent history. Well, what of their status? The status of these two sisters. Well, God says they became mine, and they bore sons and daughters. The New Living Translation says, I married them and they bore me sons and daughters. Even though marriage is not explicitly stated, it certainly seems to be implied. Oholah played the whore while she was mine, he will go on to say in verse 5, and she lusted after her lovers, the Assyrians. Yes, while she was mine. Such was the nature of their relationship with Yahweh. Well, attention now focuses upon the older sister, Oholah, and this is Samaria. It should be noted, as was the case of her younger sister in chapter 16, that this was not a forced prostitution, nor was it a prostitution born out of necessity. This was entirely voluntary prostitution, born of her lust for her lovers, for the Assyrians. Well, what was it about them that attracted her? Well, he tells us in verse 6, warriors, they were warriors clothed in purple, governors and commanders, all of them desirable young men, horsemen riding on horses. She was impressed by their appearance. She was impressed by their power and their strength. And so she prostituted herself with them. As an example of this, it might be interesting to see a little detail from the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, in which the Israelite king Jehu prostrates himself before the Assyrian king, offering gifts in exchange for protection. There you might be able to see at the bottom of the picture, sort of in the middle, the Israelite king Jehu. This is the only known, I'd say, photograph. Of course, it's not a photograph, but the only known picture of any Israelite king. There he is, bowing down before King Shalmaneser III of Assyria. And if we were to look around at the next side of this black obelisk, which incidentally is on display in the British Museum, discovered by Sir Austin Henry Layard, portraying this scene, which would date around about 840 BC. Here we see three Israelites bringing gifts to offer to the Assyrian king. So here she is. Israel is here prostituting herself before the king. So impressed were they by their appearance, by their power, and also by their idols. She was attracted by the idols of Assyria. And so the prophet tells us that she bestowed her whoring upon them, the choicest men of Assyria, all of them, and she defiled herself with all the idols of everyone after whom she lusted. It was as if Israel was completely besotted by all those around her. I mean, did she simply find them more attractive than Yahweh? Was she enamored by their sophistication? Was she impressed by their apparent success? Did she find them to be more credible and perhaps more like a proper kingdom? I mean, are there lessons that we can learn from this for ourselves today, when we might perhaps sometimes be tempted to look beyond our own spiritual community and find others elsewhere somehow more attractive? Well, God says, therefore I delivered her into the hands of her lovers, into the hands of the Assyrians after whom she lusted, and these uncovered her nakedness. They seized her sons and her daughters, and as for her, they killed her with the sword, and she became a byword among women when judgment had been executed on her. And such was the end of Oholah, the older sister. Well, attention then turns to the younger sister and to her downfall. The prophet now turns his attention to Oholibah. whom he has already identified as Jerusalem. Her sister, that is her younger sister, Oholibah, watched this. Well, we might ask, would she learn from the mistakes of her older sister? Would she take heed and learn from Oholah's mistakes and the judgment that came upon her? Absolutely not. It seems like she hadn't learned a thing, but she became even more corrupt in her lust than her sister had been, and her acts of prostitution were more numerous than those of her sister. For she also lusted after the Assyrians, governors and officials, warriors in full armor, horsemen riding on horses, all of them desirable young men, just like her big sister. She's allured by the appearance of the Assyrians. She's walking by sight and not by faith. Judah's longing for Assyria is perhaps seen no more clearly than in the days of the prophet Isaiah, when King Ahaz approached Tiglath-Pileser III for help against the Syro-Ephraimitic alliance to the north of Judah. Tiglath-Pileser III, or TP3, as he is sometimes known, is actually the first Assyrian king to be mentioned by name in the Hebrew Scriptures. He's known first of all as Pul, P-U-L. That's to be found in Tiglath-Pileser, if you like. But later he's referred to by his full name, as he is here in 2 Kings chapter 16, where we read that Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, "I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me." Ahaz also took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. How absolutely repulsive. Not only does he say to the king of Assyria, "I am your servant, I am your son," whereas in actuality he was the son of Yahweh, if you like, and jolly well ought to have been his servant. But here, in order to find protection against this Syro-Ephraimitic alliance of Syria and Ephraim, or Israel in the north, he takes that which belongs to Yahweh, which had been given by Yahweh, the silver and the gold in the house of the Lord, and offers them. Here is Ahaz, here is Jerusalem, prostituting herself before the Assyrians. And of course Isaiah strongly condemns the move. Indeed, it was then that Isaiah makes the assurance that God would give the sign of Emmanuel. All of that recorded in Isaiah chapter 7. Well, not only did Judah prostitute herself, lust after the Assyrians, but she went one further, and she lusted after the Babylonians. But she carried her whoring further. She saw men portrayed on the wall, the images of the Chaldeans portrayed in vermilion, wearing belts on their waists with flowing turbans on their heads, all of them having the appearance of officers, a likeness of Babylonians whose native land was Chaldea. When she saw them, she lusted after them and sent messengers to them in Chaldea. And the Babylonians came to her into the bed of love, and they defiled her with their whoring lust. And after she was defiled by them, she turned from them in disgust. The Babylonians, or the Chaldeans, seem to have been even more attractive than the Assyrians, so much so that Judah was determined to have them in her so-called bed of love. But like so much in life that looks too good to be true, for a very good reason, I'm quite sure, like so much that looks too good to be true, it seemed not to be long before her desire turned to disgust. In historical terms, this swing from desire to disgust reflects Judah's political swing from a pro-Babylonian policy to one which schemed against them as they sought an alliance with Egypt. But haven't we experienced the same cycle of desire to disgust, a disgust of self within our own lives? Can we not remember times in our lives when we've longed for something so much that we would have done almost anything to have it? But once we've got what we were after, the desire disappears and we're left feeling empty, disillusioned, disgusted by our deeds. But Judah was not alone in this, for God was also disgusted by what she had done. And that's really the gist of this section. For when she carried on her whoring so openly and flaunted her nakedness, I turned in disgust from her, as I had turned in disgust from her sister. And the language used at this point is even more disgusting, and it's conveying the repulsion in the heart of God over the behavior of his people. And there's only ever going to be one thing for it. Judgment is on its way. And the description of the coming judgment at the hand of all her former lovers is also deliberately descriptive. As the prophet comes to the end of his words of judgment against his people, it's as if there is no holding back. There's to be no misunderstanding. And the judgment is then delivered in 4 short messages, each beginning with the phrase, "For thus says the Lord God," the Lord Yahweh. And you'll find them there in verses 22, 28, 32, and 35. And they're fairly self-explanatory, making clear that it is Yahweh who is coming in judgment, and he'll be using those whom the people now hate, those with whom they were disgusted, in order to bring that judgment against them. The third of the 4 messages is a poem about the cup of Samaria, which simply confirms that as she has followed in the steps of her sister and learned absolutely nothing from her, so she will drink from her cup of suffering also. And in conclusion, he says, in conclusion to this section concerning the younger sister, "Therefore thus says the Lord God, because you have forgotten me and cast me behind your back, you yourself must bear the consequences of your lewdness and whoring. You remember how that last week when we looked through that list of wickedness with which the city of Jerusalem had become filled, and at the end we were reminded that they had not remembered Yahweh, their God. And the same here, they have forgotten me and cast me behind your back, he says. Well, next section, beginning in verse 36, the sisters are sentenced. And in this final section of the story of the two ugly sisters, or the tale of two cities, the prophet is called upon to pass judgment on them and to confront them with their detestable practices. They are guilty of idolatry, spoken of here as spiritual adultery. They are guilty of having blood on their hands from sacrificing their children, offering as food for gods the children which they had borne to Yahweh. They are guilty of profaning all that which was special to God. For when they had slaughtered their children in sacrifice to their idols, on the same day they came into my sanctuary to profane it. And behold, this is what they did in my house. You know, it's as if they're doing whatever they please to do all week long, but then on Sunday they're going to church as if everything was okay. And is it okay? Is it okay to live as we please according to all the ways of this world and then turn up to worship and sing praises to God as if everything was okay? Is it okay to do that? Is this not the foolishness of so much that passes for religion? Is this not the hypocrisy that is born out of thoughts of going to church and attending services, as if that's something that you can do that is in some way sort of separate from everything else? Is it okay? Of course it isn't okay. And then they're guilty of cavorting with the enemy, with their political alliances. And the language used suggests that they deliberately went out of their way to be just like everyone else, to fit in with the world around them and go along with whatever the latest trend might have been. For them, the prophet says, you bathed yourself, painted your eyes, and adorned yourself with ornaments. You sat on a stately couch with a table spread before it on which you had placed my incense and my oil. The sound of a carefree multitude was with her, and with men of the common sort. Drunkards were brought from the wilderness. They put bracelets on the hands of the women and beautiful crowns on their head. Again, here is Israel using the things with which God has blessed her in order to prostitute herself with her lovers. And then the sound of a carefree multitude was with her. Sounds like they're having a wild party as they engage in spiritual adultery with the nations around them. And the closing words bring to mind the realities of siege warfare and a lesson for us all to learn. For thus says the Lord God, bring up a vast host against them, make them an object of terror and a plunder, and the host shall stone them and cut them down with their swords. They shall kill their sons and their daughters and burn up their houses. Thus will I put an end to lewdness in the land, that all women may take warning and not commit lewdness of you as you have done. And they shall return your lewdness upon you, and you shall bear the penalty for your sinful idolatry, and you shall know that I am the Lord Yahweh. May we take warning from these words of judgment ourselves, and may we learn the lessons that need to be learned, and may we never forget the Lord our God, who is sovereign over all. Well, we leave behind chapter 23, and in chapter 24 the siege begins. And the first part of this final chapter of this significant section of the book begins by naming the day. It is the 9th year in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month. Or, if you like, it's reckoned to be equivalent to the 15th of January 588 BC. But they didn't have a January, of course, and their calendar was really rather different from ours, and they certainly were not aware that it was 588 BC. Well, this was the very day when Nebuchadnezzar began his siege of the city of Jerusalem. In less than 2 years, the city will be destroyed. And God tells the prophet to mark this day on his calendar. Well, why would he do that? Presumably so that once all this is over and a remnant join them in Babylon, having survived the destruction of Jerusalem, notes can then be compared, and none will doubt that it was through Ezekiel that God has spoken. Well, there then follows a sign of a rusty old cooking pot, and this basically informs the people that the siege, which had begun that very day, would result in the destruction of both the people, they're represented by the pieces of meat, and by the city itself, represented by the cooking pot. Well, we're going to leave that little bit behind and move on to the final part, the second half of chapter 24, and the very last section of this first major section of the book, in which we find the prophet is left devastated. And this, for the prophet, must have been the saddest day of all. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, behold, I am about to take the delight of your eyes away from you at a stroke. Yet you shall not mourn or weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the head. Bind on your turban and put your shoes on your feet. Do not cover your lips, nor eat the bread of men. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. And on the next morning I did as I was commanded. I've been teaching this book of the prophet Ezekiel for some 30 years. And I feel in that time we've come to know each other rather well. At least I feel as if I've come to know him rather well. Long ago I became particularly fond of the prophet, and I think I understand him. I certainly appreciate his approach to all this. So I felt a real sense of affinity with him, and so you must understand the irony I felt when his experiences became those of myself. I'd always found this section to be terribly sad, but when nearly 9 years ago my own wife died, when my June had to leave this life, I felt an even greater sense of solidarity with Ezekiel and perhaps even better understood something of the tragedy of this event in his life. Well, I'm thankful that I wasn't asked to react as Ezekiel was told to act here. It's true that I did not mourn as others mourn, as those who have no hope, for I am sure that we shall not forever be apart. But I was still, well, I was more than something of a wreck, and I felt completely devastated, as if the whole bottom had dropped out of my life. And I know that the prophet must have cried. He must have bawled his eyes out, but not in public. She was the delight of his eyes. He must have loved her dearly, and I cannot help but think that she would have been of immense support to him during these difficult times he had been serving as a watchman for the house of Israel. But now, from this point on, he was to go it alone. If ever he was to learn what absolute dependence upon God looked like, he would know that now. In public, he was to behave quite normally, as if nothing had happened, and all the usual and expected signs of mourning were to be absent. And of course, the people said to me, "Will you not tell us? Will you not tell us what these things mean for us, that you are acting thus?" And then I said to them, "The word of the Lord came to me. Say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will profane my sanctuary. The pride of your power, the delight of your eyes, and the yearning of your soul, and your sons and your daughters, whom you left behind, shall fall by the sword. And you shall do as I have done. You shall not cover your lips, nor eat the bread of men. Your turbans shall be on your heads, and your shoes on your feet. You shall not mourn or weep, but you shall rot away in your iniquities and groan to one another. Thus shall Ezekiel be to you a sign, according to all that he has done, you shall do. And when this comes, then you will know that I am the Lord. And why was he to do all this? Well, because they would do as he had done. When God would profane his sanctuary, the pride of their power, the delight of their eyes, and the yearning of their soul, and when their sons and their daughters whom they'd left behind were to fall by the sword, they would then do as the prophet had done. They would not mourn. But why? Why would they not mourn? Well, some suggest that it would be due to their spiritual numbness, that it would simply be too much for them to take in. Maybe. Maybe they simply wouldn't care, for in reality they have cared little for the things of God for centuries, ever since he took them out of Egypt. Or maybe they're being called upon not to mourn, but to accept all that has happened as being the just and righteous will of God. Thus shall Ezekiel be to you a sign, according to all that he has done, you shall do. And maybe there's another lesson in this for those of us bereaved of one we have loved in the Lord. Maybe when we do not mourn as others mourn, some might ask us of the hope that gives us strength, of why we don't despair as others do who have no hope. Maybe when we can speak of the passing of one we have loved in terms of victory and not be defeated by it, maybe then some might come to understand something of the substance behind our faith. Well, as for you, Son of Man, surely on the day when I take from them their stronghold, their joy and glory, the delight of their eyes and their soul's desire, and also their sons and daughters, on that day a fugitive will come to you to report to you the news. On that day your mouth will be opened to the fugitive, and you shall speak and be no longer mute, so that you will be a sign to them, and they will know that I am Yahweh. What a troubling, troubling time for the prophet. Well, next week, same time, same place, Lord willing, we will take a look at how the foreign nations will be judged and how Jerusalem has fallen. I say same time, same place. Actually, the class will be next week at 8:30, at 8:30 next Thursday evening. So I look forward to seeing you all then. We'll have a slightly shorter class than normal, I think, as we look at what is a fairly sizable section as far as chapters is concerned, but we will pass through it fairly quickly and get from it the main points that are being made within it. But so next week, look at the foreign nations, how they'll be judged, and the news that Jerusalem has fallen. May God bless you and keep you. And remember, the best is always yet to come.